The strongest change that I was maybe taken by surprise by is how quickly I came around to the idea that being fully dispassionate or not engaging with these technologies, that's a luxury that I can't have.
Welcome to the Challenging Climate Podcast, where we discuss the big ideas and controversies in climate change with leading experts. I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy specialist.
And I'm Pete Irvin, a climate scientist. The climate is changing. Join us as we try to keep up. In this episode, our guests are Benjamin Sovacool, a professor with affiliations at Aarhus University in Denmark, the University of Sussex in the UK, and Boston University in the USA.
And our other guest is Chad Baum, assistant professor at the Department of Business Development and Technology of Aarhus University. Together, they work on the perceptions and policies of technologies for climate change and the energy transition.
And they lead up the European Union-funded GENIE Project, which explores the various dimensions of carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification.
Benjamin and Chad, welcome to Challenging Climate. We're going to start off today's conversation with your latest publication, which strikes us as quite significant. Public Perceptions and Support of Climate Intervention Technologies Across the Global North and Global South. The two of you, along with Sean Lowe and Livia Fritz in Nature Communications. Can you give us the introduction about what you asked in the paper and what you found?
Sure, I'll take this first. This was kind of a very big project. So Benjamin will talk a bit later about GENIE and what that entails, trying to be this sort of flagship project in the EU setting. And what we kind of realized when we first jumped in is there's a lot of focus in the literature on basically three countries. So US, UK, and Germany. In fact, by our count, if you look at how many times those feature in public perceptions research, it's about 60 to 65% of all countries included. The Global South hadn't featured much at all. So we wanted to jump in and kind of remedy that to the extent that was possible. So this survey that we had done, and there's a focus group exercise attached, was 30 countries in 19 languages. 10 of those, you could say even 11, depending on how you group Turkey, are in the Global South. I was just looking at this again the other day, and 15 countries had never been surveyed before in the literature. For instance, Latin America has never before been surveyed or done any sort of focus group at all.
Right, you're talking about climate intervention technology. So this is the 60% that was in the UK, Germany, and the US are surveys that have been of public perception of climate intervention. What do you mean by climate intervention?
Yeah, carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering, solar radiation management modification, depending on how you want to term that. And maybe that's where to start. So there have been a few studies, not very many, that would look at multiple technologies, but it tended to be, except for one or two exceptions, that you would have random assignment of people to only receive one of those technologies. So for instance, there was one study, and then you get about 100 people that are asked about afforestation with no opportunity to compare different technologies. What we decided to do, in each country, there are at least 1,000 participants, which gives us for the survey 30,284 participants across the world for the 30 countries. And we group them according to these broad categories, which we didn't term these for the participants, but it was broadly what might be called ecosystems-based carbon dioxide removal, afforestation and reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, and then marine biomass and blue carbon. There was another group of more novel engineered carbon dioxide removal approaches. So direct air capture with carbon storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, biochar enhanced weathering, and then a solar geoengineering category, which would be stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, and then space-based geoengineering. So it was random assignment, and then depending on which group you got assigned, you were asked to give your evaluation, your perceptions of those 3 or 4 different methods. And those were, by the way, randomly ordered. It wasn't that everyone always got stratospheric aerosol injection first or DAX first. So we avoided those sort of learning effects. And by the way, as a result, we have 330 to 340 people in each country that are looking at each of these. And maybe just a quick rundown before Benjamin jumps in. The main things we asked about, what were the familiarity? How much had they heard of it before? What were their perceptions of 8 different risk and benefit items, as well as a summary measure about how they would weigh the risks versus the benefits? Did they support, on 3 different levels, did they support laboratory research? That's one. Small-scale field trials, that's another. And then broad deployment was the third, and asking on those dimensions. And then we also had a policy measure looking at support for different sort of governance or policy options.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a point about the technology coverage. And so GENIE as a whole is negative emissions and solar radiation management. And we had the foolishness in the proposal to actually talk about 20 distinct options. So we had like 10 negative emissions options like enhanced weathering and BECCS and DAC and biochar. and then 10 solar radiation management options, from sunshades to extraterrestrial interventions to ice protection to aerosol injection. And we realized really quickly that that's way too many technologies. And so what we did in the survey is we cut it in half, from 20 to 10. And we also grouped them into just 3 groups, which we felt really made it easier to understand. And so there was the SRM group, which was only stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud brightening, and space shields. And then we had a kind of nature-based carbon removal group, forestry, soils, blue carbon. And then we had an engineered carbon removal group, BECCS, DAC, enhanced weathering, and biochar. So we thought that made it a lot easier for participants. And they only got one of those 3 groups. So really, they were only considering 3 or 4 technologies at a time, which Chad told me is much better from a survey design standpoint.
That obviously covers an enormous amount of ground, 30 countries, 10 technologies put into 3 primary categories, and questions across 6 concepts, if you will. To the best you can, how would you summarize the findings of this paper?
So I would do it as follows in relation to the main categories, or let's say outcome variables, to use that terminology. 1, familiarity remains low, and we can find that both related to the global north countries that have been more surveyed, and also in the global south. There are some, such as afforestation and reforestation, where stated familiarity is much higher. The other I would mention is that we immediately found, and this is why we focus on the global north, global south dichotomy, even though we recognize there are some issues therein. And the main reason for doing that, or one of the main rationales, is that there's a lot of discussion about the lack of attention to global south publics, global south experts. So we kind of wanted to excavate that for that reason. It was because this is actually there in the literature rather than trying to impose that. And we find right away that perceived benefits were higher across the global south cohorts. There's some variation as well. There's also variation when it comes to the global north countries. But we found that when it came to all the different technologies, that it tended to be higher within the global south.
One of the other things we found, and by the way, GENIE has other data sources as well, which we'll talk about later. We've done an analysis of social media, notably Twitter and X, and we've done site visits to actually talk to entrepreneurs and innovators and some of the communities of place around those sites. And I think one of the other findings, all of this data points to the survey, the social media analysis, and the interviews with communities. Nature-based options have the highest appeal. What they think is natural, they're most comfortable with, big surprise. Then you kind of have a middle ground of like engineered carbon removal. Maybe biochar is good if you couple it to soils, and maybe BECCS is good if you manage the bioenergy supply chains well. And then you kind of get people freaking out about the solar radiation management more as a whole. But once you get into the global north, global south divide, you start to see greater acceptance of those risky options. So again, it's kind of the uniform data tells one story, but analyzing it north versus south starts to open up complexity. And people in the global south tend to be more supportive of experiments, more supportive of climate interventions, and also more precedent of experiencing climate impacts, which we think is a big determining factor of why those views are so forming.
So you said people freak out about SRM, but I was surprised to see that, if I'm right, the net approval versus disapproval, or, do they have a positive view of it or not? I think all the SRM techniques came out just positive. It wasn't that people were freaking out and were very against them. They were overall just supportive. Am I right there?
Yes, that's correct. In a sense, I don't want to overspeak or overemphasize on a scale of 1 to 5 if people have a baseline in these things. So the relative, let's say, preferences are kind of what I lean to. But SRM, for the most part, when it comes to both the perceived benefits, perceived risks, or the support, it was more on the positive end of the scale. There are some notable exceptions. And maybe I want to just kind of highlight that. When I say we had 8 different benefits and risks items, so for benefits, that would entail things like can be done safely in a controlled fashion, cost efficient and cheaper than cutting use of fossil fuels, environmentally friendly, and can be counted on in the long term. And we saw as one of the lowest ratings for the global north cohort, when asked about SRM, if it was cost efficient and cheaper than cutting the use of fossil fuels, that they tended to be a bit negative on that score. So you do see some, let's say, flashpoints that might be of concern. What is interesting, though, is whereas those patterns are pretty clear-cut for perceived benefits, we see much more variation when it comes to perceived risks. And just to highlight here, those are leads to unintended side effects, threats to humans and nature, would distribute risks unequally between rich and poor countries, and then would decrease the motivation to reduce CO2 emissions. And to highlight there, for the most part, the global north and global south cohorts did not significantly differ so much, but one area they did differ was on SRM, but not in a consistent fashion. So when it came to things like whether it was a greater threat to humans and nature, what might be called a more environmental concern, there was a higher level of risk perceived in the global north and the global south. Same was true for leads to unintended side effects. But then when you talk about unequal distributions of risks and benefits, or what we might class as the mitigation deterrence item on decreasing motivation to reduce CO2 emissions, then the Global South was more concerned. And in fact, across all of the technology categories, the Global South was more concerned about mitigation deterrence. And maybe one other interesting one, whereas the Global North was more concerned for SRM on threats to humans and nature, it was the opposite when it came to ecosystem-based carbon dioxide removal. You actually saw that even though that category tended to see relatively positive perceived benefits and relatively lower perceived risks, there was more concern in the Global South that there would be a threat to humans and nature. And we kind of extrapolate from that this could be related to those areas being the dumping grounds of things like REDD+ and other aspects. But it's just something that emerged from the data that we didn't necessarily expect.
So we've touched on, among your categories, we've touched on familiarity remaining low, risks and benefits, with perceived benefits seen as higher generally in the Global South, variation in the perceived risks, and more support, relatively speaking, for lab work and field tests of these climate intervention techniques in the Global South. Did these trends carry over to questions of the use of these technologies and to questions of policies and governance of them?
It's a very good question. So my background is as an economist, and there's this classic story of FDR saying that he only wanted one-handed economists because they kept giving him both sides of the story. So I'll start with a caveat, which is there's a question to the extent of how much the public actually distinguishes between what is a laboratory research activity versus small-scale field trials and broad deployment. That being said, you do see very clear differences in support. Afforestation and reforestation are highest, and at the bottom are the SRM, along with enhanced weathering, which is kind of an interesting one that needs to be explored a bit more. That being said, the way I like to frame this is there seems to be tepid, not acceptance, let's say, but like a license to operate or to continue to go further. And there are some reasons for that when you look at how people are concerned about climate and their exposure to climate disasters. But you definitely see that there seems to be some support for proceeding for the moment with little concerns. And then also when you look at our policy items, where we had given people 7 or 8 different domestic international policy items and asked to what extent they saw those as important before the technology could be deployed. What we see, with variation, but as the main thing, the most desirable options are providing national support and funding for public and private research and development and information and engagement campaigns to consult and inform the public. However, the lowest desired option, there's this big discussion about an international ban or moratorium on risky technologies. That was among the lowest supported of all the options. So at least for the public at the time being, you don't see that being an option that needs to be rolled out.
One thing that I found a little surprising there, because you didn't ask it, should there be a moratorium on these technologies? I think the question was, should there be a moratorium on these technologies if they're found to be risky? Which is sort of a stronger way of phrasing that, right?
It is. I think you could say that. And in general, what we see from the focus groups, and by the way, I should give a big hat tip there to our other co-authors, Livia Fritz and Sean Lowe, that there was a focus group activity of 44 focus groups in 22 countries, split by urban and rural categories. I think that at 327 participants, so quite a large exercise. And there's more details there on how these different technologies are perceived. But, something like an international ban or moratorium, I guess, with the public might come across as quite strong. And that's not seen as a path that needs to be crossed at this point. And that's something we can talk about in relation to the other paper that we have out, like Diamonds in the Sky and Environmental Politics, where that also seems to come to the fore. But maybe a good summation there would be, for the time being, it's more preferred national level activities as well as kind of light, hands-off approaches to letting these things develop as they would.
But also, I think Chad has to always stop me from overgeneralizing results and oversimplifying the sheer complexity of the survey with all of the questions and all of the dimensions. But I also think that if you wanted a headline, it could be that there are many members of the general public in the Global South who would not support a moratorium on research or deployment, given our data.
One more question about the data itself, and then thinking about its implications and your own reaction to it. Thinking about the data itself, we see these trends among the technology sets, among the questions, and among the geography of the respondents. I presume that at some point in time, you're going to work on teasing these things quantitatively out of the data. But what do you think are the leading drivers, the leading explanations of the trends across the technologies and across the countries?
That's the million-dollar question. in a sense. What we have offered or feel comfortable offering in the current paper in Nature Communications is we looked at the role of climate beliefs and also the mean age of the country population there. Those turned out to be very important. And we do find a significant difference between the global north and global south cohort when it comes to concern over climate change, when it comes to perceptions of climate harm, perceived exposure to major natural disasters in the last 3 years, as well as another item we had that continues to emerge as important, whether or not science and technology are seen as a solution to climate change. But one of the other ones that kind of emerged, and this is a very ripe area for future research, is, we had nationally representative populations here, and I should highlight that in terms of age, in terms of gender, and then above and below the median for education and income. So using that as a kind of, proxy, we find that if you live in a country whose mean age population is lower, that emerged for SRM in specific as one of the most important factors. The R squared, to use that, the explanatory power was something like 50%. It was basically not, and by the way, this is in the supplementary information. This didn't fit in the final text, but that factor did not matter for ecosystems-based carbon dioxide removal. It mattered slightly, let's say moderately, for engineered CDR, but for SRM, it was massive. So there's all these questions that then we were trying to wrestle with. Or what is it about living in a country with a younger population that then lends itself to that? Is it just being younger in general? Or is it because, a lot of these countries that have younger populations are looking towards the future and maybe have a certain sense of what's going to evolve? So that's something we definitely want to look at a bit more. And one thing is that I'm going to do a paper on climate emotions because we have an item in that as well. And that's something that we also want to look the role at fear, hope, anger, and sadness as well, and how they, let's say, map out onto these other outcome variables.
Yeah, it's hard not to plug future work. Just to give a little bit of background in terms of data too. When you account for person power, data collection costs, survey design costs, and running those focus groups, we're probably at $500,000 spent to collect the data, which is very rare for a project to have that sort of budget. It's why we're really lucky to be a European Research Council Synergy grant where we've got a budget to do that. But it also means it's like we could have written 80 papers based on this. A paper just on the US, a paper just on China, a paper just on enhanced weathering. So we're trying to do justice to the data, but also we're trying not to write too many papers. But Chad is going to explore emotions. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have this really nice Twitter paper, which was published in Global Environmental Change with the rest of our GENIE team at MCC, which was actually also on emotions. It's called Attention, Sentiment, and Emotion Towards Emerging Climate Technologies on Twitter. That actually tracks emotions and it tracks stance detection. And finally, we will be writing other papers which are under review at journals. There is one on demographics, so gender, age, and income. There is one on indigenous groups. So we had a huge subsample of the survey who identified as an indigenous group or ethnic minority or Aboriginal group. And then we've got some triangulated work with other data sets to try to think through what could be causing some of these divergent preferences, led by our colleague Alina at EASA. So it's kind of like we're just getting into it. And then we'll probably do some more nation-based stuff where we'll get deep into the German results, the UK results, et cetera, just to see what national trends may be different. So there's a lot to do. We're going to be really busy for the next 6 months doing a lot of that beyond just these two beautiful initial papers that have made it through.
We'll add a link to the paper about emotions expressed on Twitter in the show notes. One last question about this new paper in Nature Communications. What's been the reception to this set of results and conclusions when you've presented these at academic forums and other workshops?
We've done a lot of good work engaging the community. I mean, Chad has presented the paper to Sakina Jinnah at a conference that she hosted earlier last year on climate intervention. I think he also went in front of the Scopex advisory board and David Keith to present it there. We've circulated the paper for comments and drafts. We had really help from people like Holly Buck, Christina Merck, Emily Cox. So we've really done, I think, a diligent job engaging the community on how we design the survey, helping us understand some of the results. And I think there's just a great interest, I think, on both sides of the geoengineering debate. From people like Andy Parker, who are more promoting these types of projects around the world, even people like Frank Bierman, who are more prohibitive. I think everyone wants to see the survey because they recognize the data says what the data says. And in that regard, I think it's pretty clear what the findings are. And I think everyone has something to engage there. But Chad, do you want to say a little bit more?
I think Benjamin handled that well. This paper we've taken also to audiences that aren't normally in the CDR and SRM debate. And that's been kind of interesting because it's gone from something where people might immediately say, what is the reason for such research? But then when they see it kind of being, supported in some sense by the Global South publics, it has a bit more of an imprimatur then. I'm gratified by the amount of interest that has come from the experts on this topic. And I'm very happy to see it out there soon to kind of move the discussion forward. Because personally, I think when I first got into this topic, I wanted to explore some of these ideas. And now between this study and a few others, Visier's et al. From 2017, Sugiyama et al. From 2020, and there's a few others that do have Global North and Global South, they find the same thing, that when it comes to support and perceptions of risks and benefits, Global South publics are more positive. So whereas before it might be dismissed, I think slowly, no matter what side of the fence you're on, the discussion will have to move on to different arguments or different reasons. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how that evolves and where it goes next as a result of these findings.
And I know we're going to kind of jump to this in a moment about data, but let me just say that Chad is one of the most careful, rigorous survey researchers I've ever had the pleasure to meet. And there was so much care. I mean, the supplementary materials are almost as long as the articles because they go into details about how we assign people to groups, how we phrase the questions, how we randomly assign certain things, how we ordered things, all the way over to validating the languages. We actually went to colleagues who were fluent in all of the multiple languages the survey was done in. And then you had poor Chad piloting it on iPhones, Android phones, like he did it all. So there's years worth of work and care that goes into designing the survey, which tells me I think you can really trust the results. This was not just some 6-week survey that was outsourced to some firm. It's like there was a lot of care and thoughtful selection that makes the data one of the most rigorously collected that I think will exist for some time. Thanks both to the scale of our budget, but also the talent of Chad.
Benjamin's far too kind. I would just add that's a very important thing to say, that we've had support from other people in the survey public perceptions community giving feedback, and Jeff want to highlight that, and also the experts. So we wouldn't presume to try to translate this into languages in which we're not fluent, and there were experts that helped us translate a list of keywords. And maybe one other thing Benjamin touched on that I always forget to say. We had both a wholly uniquely developed or independently developed version for smartphones and for desktops. And in certain countries in the global south, it was like 75% of people took it on their smartphones. And so that was kind of very important. Another thing, because that ends up coming up as being asked, well, you're obviously limiting your sample if you're only doing it on the desktop. But that was something that, along with Norstat, the company that we did this with, and they were very supportive and helpful, that was developed, and that was important to do.
Now, I just want to move on to think a bit more broadly about public perception research. And I guess you talked a little bit about how this research might change the debate because it speaks to some common talking points that have been had, some parts of the argument already. But how should this kind of result be interpreted in the policy process? Should it change people's minds, or is this too preliminary?
I hope it opens up rather than closes down discussions over geoengineering, climate interventions for first. I think that's why we intentionally have really difficult themes in the survey: governance, moratoria, mitigation deterrence, stance detection, emotions, values. That's all there. These are not easy things to grapple with. I think that it also will speak directly to kind of ongoing policy debates. And I also think it will help decenter the global north, right? One of the things we talk about in the paper is there's much of this obsession with weird countries. That's Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. And there was a great piece in Nature about 10 years ago that found that like weird countries are 13% of the global population, but 87% of the research that we do. And so I really think the fact that our sample is more than a dozen global South publics in their own terms with representative samples, and this is even in focus groups as well, which we didn't talk about, I think is a rare opportunity to let the public speak for themselves, which is good not just for policy, but civil society and research. So I think we're kind of one of these tripartite audiences of beyond policy. There's something in it for everyone when you let these communities have a voice.
Well, I guess the big challenge here is you're asking people quite difficult questions about something many of them have never heard about in the space of, I'm not quite sure how long your survey took. How do you approach that as a general problem? This unfamiliarity, you're introducing the topic to them. How do you go about doing that in a way that's neutral, balanced, gets to something valuable?
Yeah, it becomes very difficult. And we mentioned this in the paper, drawing on the phrasing and framing that people like Emily Cox, Nick Pidgeon, Elspeth Spence have used. But there's a term in literature where it's called pseudo-opinions, that for relatively novel, unfamiliar topics, that these are malleable to new information, they might change, which is why I will never say that this is the be-all, end-all of where things will be in the next 5 years. But I think it's definitely a global baseline for where things are now, the types of publics that one can expect to encounter. That could change if a certain orange-skinned figure in the US were to come out in favor or against one of these technologies, then that could really change the discussion tomorrow. So I think it's a moment in time. We do have to handle it with care. So, we took certain steps having quality checks throughout, making sure that having trap questions that if they didn't answer it a certain way, that they might be removed from the survey. If they sped through the survey, completing it too short of time, they were also removed. There's one that prompted a bit of discussion, but for instance, in the focus groups, we had a question, do you believe that climate change is occurring? And then they could answer yes, but natural processes play a bigger role, or no. People answering no were removed from the focus groups, and we can kind of get into that. So there's all these things in terms of external validity. One way we did this is tried to keep the information text that we gave them relatively short. And also we had developed icons that you can also see in the paper that accompanied the questions about an item throughout as sort of a visual cue. And by the way, every time there was a question about that, they could click for more information to go back and see it again. This repetition aspect. But that's not to say things definitely aren't going to change in the future.
Yeah, let me just add that the survey was really designed to be very visual. And we also debated whether we'd give them any information treatments or not. We decided to, but it was very balanced. So for each of the options, we give an image, and the images were co-designed with our colleagues at MCC, who do the State of CDR report, and already are really good at visualizations. And so we self-designed visualizations for the survey and focus groups, which we tested within the GENIE team, which was also our colleagues at EASA. And it took us about a month to kind of get the description right, where we did. Each one is kind of balanced. There's a pro, there's a con, it's easy to understand, and it's pretty much retained. I think those materials were quite good, and we're happy to share them. They're in the supplementary material, and I think they work pretty well. So that was kind of our middle ground of we give a short 2-minute education of these options in the survey itself, and the respondents couldn't go through it too quickly. And we even quizzed them later in the survey to kind of say, did you pay attention? So there's kind of other ways of ensuring quality. So yeah, I think we kind of went out of our way to at least try as best as we could to hedge the unfamiliarity and lack of knowledge of these options.
And by the way, I might add, it depends on the country. But what I was shocked by, especially in a lot of the African countries or the Global South countries, we had a quality check at the end that was just a question to report any problems. And the amount of positive, interested comments that came out of this and, being interested in learning about this new issue, it was quite telling.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting to see these little icons there. How much of an impact do you think the aesthetic element had? You said people like nature and stuff. So, something that might look like a chemical versus something that might look like a leaf. How much of a role do you think that played in shaping the responses you got?
Well, let me just first say that we tried to make the diagrams pretty neutral and bland. So some of them were scarier before the ones that you saw. And that was the feedback. Looks too scary, or maybe evokes more negative reactions. Like if you see stratospheric aerosol injection and a really dark sky and a purple cloud and a red sun, well, that's very different than if it's a blue sky and a nice yellow sun. So we at least did try to design them to be as neutral as possible. But even then, I'm sure Chad can now tell you more about some of the reactions people had.
Well, I would say before coming to work with Benjamin, I was working more in the agricultural and food domain. So on things like genetic modification in food, CRISPR-Cas, and novel plant breeding technologies, or even cultivated meat. So I get a bit paranoid when it comes to the use of certain words. Benjamin might even say a bit too paranoid, but we minimized any reference to things like chemicals or sort of, trigger words that might, if you find natural anywhere in any of our texts, I will probably defenestrate myself right here and now. But so we tried to limit in that sense, those sorts of effects.
There's this issue of acquiescence bias. Am I right? That if you say, do you agree with this? People are more likely to agree with it than disagree. Is that something you thought about in your design? And how do you approach that? Can you ask questions both ways around?
Yeah, so depending on the framing, that has a big effect. So there's little things we wouldn't ask, do you agree? It's to what extent do you agree with this? So of course it differs. We tried to have reverse coded items for some of them as well. There's little things that you get into in the literature. So common method, common measurement bias. So if every one of your scales is 1 to 7, that can affect correlation between all of them. So varying them in that way. There were all these little things that would go into it a bit. We also made sure for most of the items, not all, to have a don't know or opt out option. That's also very important because some people just forcing them to make a decision can actually impact things one way or the other. But one of the more interesting things that came out here, and that's something that I continue to wrestle with, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it's settled in the future, is there's something called cultural response styles that we noticed, for instance, for the familiarity item, that for a lot of them, the global South countries tended to be a bit higher. And there's no plausible explanation for that. You can get into some cultural things. I won't stereotype here, but there are certain countries that people immediately said, oh, this or that person or someone from that country is known for never saying that they don't know where they're going or where they ask for directions. And you kind of do see that. But we then also kind of dug into the psychometric literature and found out that in Western countries, weird countries, there are more extreme response styles. So if you give a scale of 1 to 5, they're more likely to choose 1 or 5. Whereas in more Asian countries, for instance, it might be more in the middle. So then, we were trying to explain that, but then it gets quite interesting because if you use that to explain familiarity and you say these people are tending more towards the mean of the scale because of their cultural response style, well, then what does that say about our findings for support? Because that would suggest that they should be closer to the mean and not so extreme. So in that case, then it could be that the extremity of the responses is actually an underestimate. But this is something that I think only emerged for the fact that we had so many countries. We actually had a global north versus global south comparison. But it's something that I think one of the more interesting ones is in India, for instance, we had these trap questions, and that seemed to create a lot of difficulty for responding there. So even some of the kind of standard best practice survey measurement techniques seem to not translate so well into certain contexts. So it's almost, an enjoinder for the field to kind of develop methods that work better in certain countries.
I was going to ask you exactly about that. That familiarity gap was a real quirky result I spotted. But anyway, I'll move on. You've got another paper that came out actually just before this one on public perceptions of SRM and field tests in countries that have had some recently. So Mexico, the UK, and USA. Could you tell us a little bit about that background, the story that motivated you to do this set of surveys?
Well, for longtime listeners of this podcast, I probably don't have to say too much since the individuals in charge there were kind of the motivating factor. But yeah, I always have to make sure I say it right because we called it something different. So for Make Sunsets, when that came out and the very intrepid reporting of James Temple, and then when we heard about the Satan trials a bit after that. So for me, that seemed to suggest that this was going to finally be a moment where this would break through into the public consciousness. People would start being interested. And spoiler alert, it's another instance of being in your kind of online community of things that you think are going to be very important that don't actually then break through. But I went to Benjamin and I said, we need to do this study right now. We need to kind of look to see how this affects perceptions before it kind of becomes way too clear. And Benjamin said, sure, let's do that. That's the short version.
The longer version is I advised against it because it was so much work and he was already, running a 30-country survey. But Chad did this on the side as a hobby. So this is one of Chad Baum's hobbies, is he likes to run experimental research designs and execute them. And Pete, when you said earlier kind of like how you phrase things matters, we actually tested that explicitly in this study with framing. And I'll let Chad talk more about it, but we intentionally got into, does the public care if it's a corporate actor, government actor? Do they care with how you describe it as positive or negative? And I'll let Chad kind of tell you how it doesn't really matter.
I mean, yeah. So to use the term of art, we presented publics from Mexico, United States, and United Kingdom with vignettes that were sort of made to look like newspaper articles. And for doing this, I basically looked at all the articles on Make Sunsets, which we obviously don't want to use the exact names of people. So the fictitious company is called Make Sunrises for the current paper. But we used a systematic approach to develop these different treatments, and they differed on 3 dimensions. So where it was taking place, either in Mexico or the United Kingdom, kind of mirroring these 2 trials. Who was the actor involved? Was it a Silicon Valley startup? Or was it a university researcher? And what was the scale and purpose of the activity? Was it, for research aims, small scale, or was it broad, large scale with commercialization intent? And then so we use that to make 9 different headline treatments. So 8+1 control. And then we randomly assign this to people, more than 1,000 in each country, to see if these had an effect on their perceptions of the technology.
I guess in terms of a bit more on the background story, because these experiments, the Make Sunsets was in the US and Mexico, and we have an interview with Luke Eisman that I'll link to in the episode. And then the UK had this Satan experiment. And the UK and US have not reacted at all, as far as I can tell, like at least governmentally. But in Mexico, some minister for the environment, I think, said Mexico's going to ban this, solar geoengineering is out, no more experiments, and is now, I think, out there trying to make moves internationally to sort of shut this down. Does that reflect the attitudes of the UK and US versus Mexico that you found in your results?
To a pretty fair extent, it does. So again, you have to be a bit careful based on what we already said about familiarity. But when we asked the representative publics in Mexico, United States, and UK, about a quarter of people in Mexico said they were familiar or they had prior awareness of stratospheric aerosol injection. So it was higher and significantly different. The other thing that kind of emerges there is almost an emerging, let's say, regulatory approach in Mexico, which is that it tended to have, again, we found the highest support overall for stratospheric aerosol injection, as well as maybe that's something to dispel it here because there's something interesting that we'll have to kind of better understand. But when we asked again about the perceived balance of benefits to risks, there was no difference between the 3 countries, but they did differ in terms of support for the development and deployment. And then when we asked about governance options here, it was a simplified set of 3: national level regulation and oversight, international ban or moratorium, and engagement campaigns to consult the public. What we find is that, again, international ban or moratorium was the lowest of the three, but the strongest level of support in Mexico is for national level regulation and oversight. So you both see support, wanting to see it rolled out, some familiarity, while at the same time wanting to see that accompanied by national level regulation and oversight, which in a way mirrors what's being done at the moment in Mexico. So that does seem to signal a potential pattern or way forward for this technology.
So the new paper and much of your work recently has been under the GENIE Project, and this has been mentioned a couple times before. This is an acronym for geoengineering and negative emissions pathways in Europe. Benjamin, can you tell us a little bit about the GENIE Project?
Thanks, and you got the acronym right, so I'm really impressed. Yeah, and it's meant to be GENIE, kind of cheekily, but also kind of aptly, in that these options are kind of like the genie in the bottle, and they could escape the bottle and grant us our wishes of climate protection, or escape the bottle and wreak havoc around the world. So they're kind of tries to capture this very iterative moment of truth for us about how either pathways could become potentially possible at this critical moment in climate policy. But the project is a European Research Council grant. It's called a Synergy grant, and there are 3 criteria for winning these grants. The first is you have to tackle an urgent social problem. And some of the other teams we were competing with were like saving religious artifacts from Syria or piloting new vaccines. So it's kind of like really potent social problem focused. They need to be risky, and you need to evidence that you can't fund them with other research councils. And we were really happy here because we were rejected 3 times initially with this grant. So we had the rejection letters with us, including one from the ESRC in the UK that said, it's too interdisciplinary, go to the EPSRC. And then the EPSRC said, it's too interdisciplinary, go to the ESRC. So we had that proof when they asked that question, why isn't it fundable? We're like, it's too interdisciplinary for these poor UK research councils. And it is. It's really deep interdisciplinarity that is challenging for any research council to fund. And that's the third thing, is you have to show deep collaborations with kind of scholars and communities you don't normally work with. And so I'm a qualitative social scientist, and I decided to team up with 2 great institutions, MCC, the Mercator Institute for Climate Change in Berlin, which does a lot of quantitative evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, machine learning, topic modeling, large-scale population-level assessments of things like Twitter or parliamentary debates. And then the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, which does integrated assessment modeling. So that's kind of framing the whole project. Qualitative social science meets evidence synthesis meets modeling. And then we kind of went nuts. The proposal has 12 research questions and 8 work packages, which is kind of ridiculous. All over the place, though, from state of the evidence and what the communities currently think about risks and benefits with systematic reviews, over to social acceptance, over to innovation dynamics, over to policy and politics and governance. And then finally, I can't believe we got away with this, rather than wed ourselves to any single framework, like diffusion of innovations or technological innovation systems, we decided to actually pursue a meta-theoretical framework. Not sure what that means, but it sounded good. And the meta-theoretical framework talks about socio-technical systems, political economy and justice, and innovation and acceptance. And so that's kind of nice too. Those are kind of cross-cutting themes that belie all of the GENIE work.
So it's ambitious for sure. Covering geoengineering is another word for solar geoengineering, presumably SRM, solar radiation modification, and negative emissions, meaning carbon dioxide removal. I've seen numerous papers published out of the GENIE Project, and I think you're about halfway done. What are some of the key findings that you've uncovered thus far?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think I can really make it simple, though. Like when I'm talking to my parents about, what is your project doing, honey? I don't get into details of framing, right? Or effect sizes from within a sample. I think the first one is that there's a lot of contestation over these options, whether you like them or not. The fact that they do provoke emotion, the fact that they do have sets of risks and benefits, does mean that they're going to be difficult. Right? They will provoke opposition, and we've looked at experiments, we've done our own trips to experiments, we've done these surveys, and even in the surveys that Chad just said, there are still people who oppose, and there are still people who do support a moratorium, although there are many who don't. I think the second one is really sobering, and I really like this term risk trade-off. That's this kind of term from the medical and environmental literature of you deploy a technology or a program to solve one risk, but it only creates an adverse risk. And in a real neat way, you can kind of read all of carbon removal as a risk trade-off of transferring risks from the climate to the land. How well are we going to manage forests and carbon reservoirs and so forth? Or in time, That would kind of be SRM. How do we deploy now to try to create future reductions in temperature that could be even riskier? So I think that's the kind of notion, is that most of these options never eliminate risk. They redistribute it spatially or temporally or sectorally, but it's still there, which means you will need very strong patterns of governance. And I think the final one is maybe relating to contestation, is just that the scientific community doesn't seem to also have a consensus on these issues, right? We've got lots of studies that are one-sided and say we're against it, or yay, look at the co-benefits, we're for it, or they're unidimensional. They're looking at the economics of CDR. They're looking at the ethics of CDR. They're looking at social acceptance of SRM, but they're not doing it all. And that's where the kind of ambition of GENIE came in. Like, we've got the scope, we've got the person power, we got about 40 people on the project, we've got 6 years, we have 9 million euros. So we kind of one of the few that can go that complex at all of the options, all of the portfolios, all the benefits, all the trade-offs, which is why we're really lucky we got it, because it's the sort of proposal that if we didn't, no one else could fund the scale and scope of what we're doing. It's too much.
Are you studying the contestation within the field? Because I think that's a really interesting problem. It seems to me, I might be wrong, that the greatest opposition to these ideas comes from within the climate community, from these internal debates. Is that right? And are you studying it? And have you found anything interesting on that yet?
Yeah, we've started to really study it. We've got a great piece on publics that Livia Fritz has led, using ecologies for participation, which is also at re-review at Nature Communications. And that is great. That actually creates a whole spectrum of what the public wants to be. Some want to be passive and apathetic. Some want to be ambivalent. And some want to be engaged. So there's also, it's like no such thing as like there's the public and they only take one stance. There's a whole ecology of ways in which they want to be engaged, which is kind of very fascinating when you think about the complexity of opinion. And then I have to give credit to Sean Lowe for looking at a study called Taking It Outside, where he looked at 21 experiments, opposition and acceptance. And there he goes in and creates a playbook. There's actually a commonality in terms of how civil society groups oppose these interventions and harness certain scientific claims. And then there's a counter strategy of defense using scientific claims from the advocates. And that's really neat, because you kind of see these two playbooks of opposition and acceptance kind of circulating and co-evolving with the technologies. They make similar claims, they may have similar framing devices, and they may have different types of expertise. So that helps explain why the community is fragmented, because geographers are saying one thing, but the engineers are saying another. So there's kind of contestation within different disciplines. And then we finally did expert interviews, 125 of them, which may or may not have been with people who are currently on this podcast. I cannot say. And we did an expert elicitation exercise to try to gauge a degree of consensus, and that only confirms the dissensus, that the experts don't agree. They don't agree about risks. They don't agree about deployment. They don't even agree about efficacy of whether we should have SRM. Chad, you want to add anything about expert contestation and disagreements within experts that we've come across?
I might actually broaden out to talk about publics, because one thing that emerged when we did the Like Diamonds in the Sky paper on stratospheric aerosol injection, again, it's buried in the supplementary materials because we couldn't fit it in, but we had this question at the end that asked for any final comments. And what was quite fascinating were the different almost cultures of response in the different ones. In the United States, there was a much higher prevalence of conspiratorial kind of thinking and mistrust in government. And we have some quotes in the supplementary material about that. Whereas in the UK, almost conforming to expectations, there was a desire to withhold judgment until there was more information, saying, how can I possibly be asked to comment about this technology if I don't know how it would be deployed? And then in the context of Mexico, it was more, I'm very happy to learn about this new thing, tying it to climate change and the problems there, and just generally being curious and more forward looking in that sense. So again, it's a pattern. It's not all the people, but it was interesting as well to see that kind of emerge, and just about the way that the national discussions are going to change in the future. And actually, maybe I link that back to the question about policy and the way forward for the future. What I was struck by is, if I were to summarize the governance literature when it comes to experts, the main talking points or the main themes are whether an international ban or moratorium of some type is required. And then in carbon removal, there's about a global carbon market that's discussed at the IPCC level. And then there's also, led by Yannis Pastor, a kind of push for international level discussion. But what we found as being the most desirable options from the public were national level support and funding, some sort of national level regulation, and sort of capacity building information and engagement campaigns at the domestic level. Exactly the kind of things that aren't being talked about, or talked about very rarely in the expert literature. So it kind of identifies a blind spot or a gap that needs to be addressed in the future.
And let me just build on this a little bit. Just talk more about our positionality. I'm often asked by colleagues, am I for or against geoengineering? And it's like, we're neither. Like, we don't want to be. We really want to be independent and dispassionate. There's this notion, I'm trained in science technology studies, about symmetry and reflexivity. Symmetry means whenever there's a contentious issue, you do talk about both sides. And reflexivity means you're very open to thinking about your own issues, positionality, training, and so forth. And I think that may be where some of our colleagues go awry, right, with their expertise. I have a book with Johns Hopkins Press called Fact and Fiction in Global Energy Policy. And at the end of that book, because we talk about contestations over shale gas, hydrogen, renewables, geoengineering, adaptation, the whole EVs, and we kind of come across that a lot of the fiercest debate is from what we call, let's see, gosh, I'm going to forget the term, technological evangelists. People who are so convinced in one technology as our savior, experts. It's solar, it's hydrogen, and it's nuclear. Gosh, I've been accused as being an eco-Nazi by the pro-nuclear people for my position on nuclear power. But they're really convinced, almost with religious fervor, that their preferred technology is the solution. And what we really need instead is a lot more technological agnosticism, right? Not a commitment to any single technology, but an open debate and dialogue about how these complexities and risks co-evolve. And I think that's the trick. I think a lot of people are right now caught in that level of evangelism, for or against, rather than a more multiplicitous, non-dualistic view that could be yes, maybe, right? Or no, but, that acknowledges these complexities and doesn't reduce it to a very simple yes or no. And I think that's, very hard for a lot of us to do in the academy because we like ourselves and we like to be certain and we're confident in our expert judgment. And it's very hard to consider the opposing view. And that may explain some of the entrenchment with some of our colleagues who are legitimately experts, but are still evangelists.
Recognizing that you try to remain fairly balanced in your views on such contentious issues, certainly when you're wearing your academic hat, your researcher hat. Now that you've been involved in GENIE for a year and a half, 2 years now is my quick estimate. A question for both of you is, what surprised you and have your views changed?
I'll go first. Gladly let Chad. What surprised me, one of the things we've done with GENIE is site visits. I think we've done up to 20 now around the world, where we've gone to some of these experimental sites. We've been to Harvard, we've looked at the aerosol injection lab from Frank, and we've looked at Scopex, the gondola. We've been to look at seagrass planting in Wales. Chad has been to see Project Vesta. Livia was out in Hawaii looking at ocean alkalinity enhancement. I've been to Maine looking at running tide. I've also been to Iceland to look at the DAC facility there, and Greenland to look at ice protection. And Chad and I had the displeasure of going to the Great Barrier Reef, lucky us, to look at cloud brightening and fogging and shading and enhanced weathering. So it's kind of like one of the things that really surprised me is like before GENIE started, I'm like, these things are just on paper. They're wacky. They're science fiction. But now going around the world, it's like they are being seriously researched. There is physical kit and tech and pilots, whether it's kelp beds or satellites, or aircraft designs or nozzles or different types of minerals they're sprinkling on cropland, like it can be possible. That was a real eye-opener for me that these are no longer just hypothetical. If we decided we wanted to do a sun shield, we probably could. If we decided we wanted a regional aerosol program, we probably could. So that was something shocking to me, is like the deployability of a lot of these options is more potentially there than I ever would have realized had I not gone from site to site.
I would say that in the 2.5, 3 years that I've been working on this, the strongest change that I was maybe taken by surprise by is how quickly I came around to the idea that being fully dispassionate, that's not to say trying to remain objective and seeing both aspects of this, but being fully dispassionate or not engaging with these technologies, that's a luxury that I can't have. I think I've come around to that. And so I try to evaluate these things to give them a fair shake. And I would say, by the way, that Benjamin and I are speaking here. GENIE's a big consortium, and there are many different positions within, and people are allowed to speak their own minds. So that's something important. But for my own part, I find persuasive that at least these need to be given a fair hearing. And for me, fair hearing means going to the publics and letting them make up their own minds, not trying to kind of impose my views on that. I know there seems to be a sense of a lot of people, and we say this at the end of the Nature Communications paper, a lot of times people will say that this is what the Global South publics do or don't want. And then they purport to speak on behalf of the Global South publics. I'm not sure how anyone can do that in this sense while claiming to state that there's diversity and everything else. Respecting that means actually going to the people and trying to find the best tools and methods in order that they can speak their own minds or kind of, express their concerns and reservations and be involved in guiding the development of these technologies. So I would say those two are what I've seen evolve over the last 3 years and what I hope to continue to see evolve.
I can add one small thing. One of the things we did in our expert interviews is we did ask about risks and benefits. So we took 125 people and said, what do you think some of the risks and benefits are? And this was, I guess, another shocking finding. We had 107 distinct co-impacts beyond climate protection. So take climate change out of it. There are 107 reasons to oppose or support these options. And what's interesting is that there was a slightly more positive benefits than negative risks for carbon removal, but slightly more negative risks than perceived benefits for solar radiation management. But I think that gets into the kind of heart of this debate. If there are 107 reasons to do and not do, that also explains the contestation, it explains the complexity, and it unpacks the whole cascade of economic, political, social, cultural, and technical dimensions of what these options can affect. Everything from food security for small-scale farmers to urban heat effects, all the way over to water use, even war and international conflict, which could mimic nuclear war. That's one of the things that came out, how these could be weaponized, or at least perceived to be weaponized, or even miscalculated and perceived to be used strategically. India accuses China of an aerosol program they never had as a pretext to launch a war. Right, so I think that really says what's at stake. And for me, that's also quite shocking. And it reflects the diversity of scholarship and that we seem to have at least 100 different arguments that support or oppose these types of interventions.
Well, we like to end on a positive note. So what gives you hope that we can have constructive global debate on such issues?
I'll go first and I'll be short. I think the co-impacts I just mentioned, the fact that there are still 50 or 60 positive reasons to do it, including many of the SDGs, does say that done right, well designed, with good governance and at least appropriate consultation with communities, we can use these options to save coral reefs, enhance food security, promote farmers, create co-impacts, create jobs, resilience, and a whole variety of other things. And so there are a lot of good potential reasons to do these interventions if they're done right.
I'm glad Benjamin went first. And that also that you mentioned hope there, because in a sense, the more I work on this topic, hope is kind of irrelevant, or it's not something that actually guides me here. And maybe this is something that's going to come out in the climate emotions paper. But when I think about the emotions that need to be involved here, hope is what it is. And there's enough poets that have talked about this in that way. But it's the sense that we're going to need this in one extent or the other, and we're going to need information to know how best to roll it out and deploy it in portfolio, and in a way that suits local context. And Benjamin has written a very important paper on whole systems justice here to make sure that this is actually to the benefit of local people. So I'm not sure hope is exactly what I'm aiming at, but just we do our best to provide as much information as possible for decision makers, not policymakers, decision makers, to kind of use these technologies and the tremendous work being done by very inspired, motivated, and intelligent people around the world, to see these potentially be solutions that I think a lot of people would say that we hoped we wouldn't need, but we're probably going to in some sense.
Well, thanks to both of you for joining us, and put lots of links to some of these papers you mentioned. Not sure we'll get to all of them. Thanks a lot. Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.